December 2nd, 1984. 4 missionaries knocked on a door in Guadalajara. It was the wrong door. They were shot into an open grave. Their bodies have never been found. From a roadblock in Tamaulipas to a mountain road in Sonora, these are 10 times Americans messed with the wrong cartel. Section 1. The Mascarenas and Carlson couples. Benjamin and Pat Mascarenas had not gone to Guadalajara looking for trouble. They had gone there to help a friend. Benjamin was 29 years old, and his wife Pat was 27, and the two of them had been living in a small town in Nevada when the invitation came. In 1984, a wealthy friend of theirs in Guadalajara was in poor health and needed looking after. The Mascarenases were the kind of people who showed up for that. They packed their things, crossed the border, and moved south into a city they ended up genuinely loving. Pat's sister-in-law, Pat Romero, who would later spend decades keeping her brother's name alive, remembered the couple speaking about Guadalajara with real warmth. They loved the city, she said later. They found it beautiful, and they were able to carry on the faith work that mattered deeply to both of them. Benjamin and Pat were Jehovah's Witnesses, and for them, going door to door in a new city wasn't an obligation. It was the point. It was the whole reason to be there. Once they had settled in and grown comfortable in Guadalajara, they invited another couple to join them. Dennis Carlson was 32 years old and originally from Redding, California. His wife Rose was 36. The Carlsons were missionaries too, and like the Mascarenases, they came to Guadalajara with the same purpose that had defined the way they lived their lives, knocking on strangers' doors, introducing themselves, sharing their faith, and moving on to the next house. In a city the size of Guadalajara, this kind of work could go on indefinitely. There were always more blocks, more streets, more doors. For two couples who believed in what they were doing, this was not a burden. It was simply their life, carried forward into a new country. What none of them could have known was that they had arrived in Guadalajara at one of the most dangerous moments in the city's modern history, inside a window of time when the men who ran Mexico's most powerful drug trafficking operation were in a state of pure, consuming rage, and that rage was looking for somewhere to land. Guadalajara, in 1984, was the operational headquarters of what law enforcement called the Guadalajara Cartel, a sprawling criminal organization built by 3 men, Rafael Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. Fonseca Carrillo, known by the nickname Don Neto, was one of the organization's founding figures, a man who had spent years building a network that moved marijuana and heroin north across the border in enormous quantities. Caro Quintero, younger and widely described as far more volatile, managed the cartel's agricultural operations and had constructed what was, at the time, the single largest marijuana plantation ever discovered in Mexico. The plantation, known as Rancho Buffalo, sat in the northern state of Chihuahua, across roughly 2,500 acres of land. At the height of the growing season, it employed an estimated 7,000 farmhands. It was, by any measure, an industrial enterprise built around a single product, and it generated a staggering amount of money for the men who owned it. On November 14, 1984, that enterprise was destroyed in a single morning. Working on intelligence built by a DEA special agent named Enrique Camarena, Mexican military forces descended on Rancho Buffalo and burned it to the ground. The raid wiped out thousands of tons of marijuana in one operation and cost the Guadalajara cartel a loss that investigators estimated at several $billion. For the cartel's leadership, the financial blow was catastrophic. For Caro Quintero in particular, who had poured years of work and planning into building that plantation, the raid was something closer to personal. He needed someone to blame, and within the organization, a name circulated quickly: Camarena, the DEA agent stationed in Guadalajara, the man who had brought this down on them. That fury, and what it produced over the weeks that followed, is the backdrop against which Benjamin and Pat Mascarenas and Dennis and Rose Carlson were going about their ordinary missionary work in December of 1984. They had no connection to the DEA. They had no connection to the drug trade. They were two couples doing the same thing they did everywhere they went, walking up to unfamiliar houses, knocking, and waiting to see who answered. In a city where trust had collapsed entirely among cartel members who suspected everyone of being a government agent, this ordinary, pastoral activity was about to become lethal. On December 2nd, 1984, the four missionaries approached a door in Guadalajara and knocked on it. The available evidence, reconstructed years later through the testimony of a man who was present, suggests the door they knocked on was connected directly to Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo's operation. Inside were cartel personnel and, according to the witness, a young man who would later become the most wanted drug trafficker in the world. His name was Joaquin Guzman Loera, known even then by the nickname El Chapo. He was in his late 20s, a rising figure within the Guadalajara cartel, and by multiple accounts, he was already known within the organization for a willingness to commit violence that other men found difficult to look at directly. The account of what happened to the four missionaries comes primarily from a former Jalisco State Judicial Police officer named Jorge Godoy. Godoy had been assigned as a bodyguard to Fonseca Carrillo and was present during the events he later described to investigators and, eventually, on camera for a Dallas television station, becoming the first person with direct knowledge of the killings to speak publicly and allow himself to be identified. Godoy was placed in witness protection in the United States, and when he agreed to speak, he was candid about the continued fear he lived with, even years after leaving Mexico. According to Godoy's account, the four Americans were tortured after they were taken. The women were raped, the men were beaten, and subjected to hours of violence before the killings began. Guzman, Godoy said, then shot each of the four missionaries one by one, and they fell into an open grave that had been prepared for them. The account was corroborated by former DEA agent Hector Bereles, who spent years working the Camarena murder investigation and had access to confidential witnesses and evidence the public never saw. Bereles said he had multiple witnesses placing Guzman at the scene and described the weapon used as a 9mm Uzi submachine gun. The four Americans were shot, buried, and in the days that followed, all trace of where their bodies had been put was erased. It needs to be said clearly that Joaquin Guzman was never tried for the murders of the four missionaries. The allegations against him in this case came from witness testimony provided to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, and those witnesses, including Godoy, were prepared to testify in court, but no charges were ever formally brought against Guzman related to this specific incident. His eventual American prosecution, which concluded in 2019 with a conviction on drug trafficking and other charges in a Brooklyn federal courtroom, did not include the murders of Benjamin, Pat, Dennis, and Rose. In that sense, the case against El Chapo for what happened on December 2nd, 1984, has never been formally adjudicated, and likely never will be. What is certain is that the bodies of the four missionaries have never been found. 40 years later, there is no grave to visit, no confirmed location, no physical record of where four American citizens who traveled to Mexico to knock on strangers' doors and share their faith were ultimately put into the ground. Pat Romero, Benjamin's sister, spent decades holding on to whatever information she could find and trying to keep her brother's name in the public conversation. When investigative reporters contacted her in 2018 about the renewed interest in Guzman's alleged involvement, she was 68 years old and said that the family had not heard anything meaningful from the US government in years. Her mother, she said, was in a state that the news alone, each time it surfaced and then went quiet again, made worse. There had been too many of these cycles, too many moments where it seemed like something might finally move forward, followed by silence. The institutional context around this case matters because the murders of the four missionaries did not occur in isolation. They were the opening act in a 9-week killing spree that the Guadalajara cartel directed against Americans in and around Guadalajara between December of 1984 and February of 1985. On January 30th, 1985, 2 more Americans were killed at a restaurant in the city under strikingly similar circumstances, approached by cartel men who assumed they must be government spies. And on February 7th of that same year, DEA Special Agent Enrique Camarena was kidnapped outside his office, tortured for roughly 30 hours, and murdered. An event that would become the most extensively documented and prosecuted act of cartel violence against an American in the agency's history. All of these killings were connected to the same organizational rage that had been set loose by the Rancho Buffalo raid in November, and the missionaries were the first to die from it. The relationship between the 4 missionaries' murders and the broader investigation into Camarena's death is complicated and worth understanding. Operation Leyenda, the massive American homicide investigation launched after Camarena's body was found in March of 1985, was focused almost entirely on the DEA agent's killing. The missionaries, who had died more than 2 months earlier and whose bodies had not even been located, received far less institutional attention. American investigative resources poured into Mexico in response to Camarena's murder in a way that had simply never been done before. And while the missionaries' cases were nominally part of that broader investigation, they occupied a smaller space in the public record and in the court proceedings that followed. The men most directly responsible for the environment in which the killings occurred, Caro Quintero and Fonseca Carrillo, were both eventually arrested in Mexico in 1985 in the immediate wake of the Camarena investigation. Caro Quintero received a 40-year sentence in Mexico. Fonseca Carrillo received a similar sentence. Neither faced American prosecution for the missionaries' deaths, and in 2013, after serving 28 of his 40 years, Caro Quintero was released by a Mexican appeals court on a legal technicality, a development that horrified the families of every American who had been killed by his organization during those years. He walked out of prison and went straight back into drug trafficking, triggering new rounds of violence in northern Mexico and eventually landing on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, specifically because of Camarena's still unresolved murder charge. Mexican forces recaptured Caro Quintero in 2022. He was extradited to the United States in February of 2025 and arrived in a Brooklyn federal courthouse to face charges that included conspiracy to murder and running a continuing criminal enterprise. He pleaded not guilty. His trial, when it eventually happens, will center on Camarena. Whether the murders of Benjamin and Pat Mascarenas and Dennis and Rose Carlson are ever formally addressed in an American courtroom in connection with Caro Quintero remains an open question. The legal proceedings that have touched their case most directly have always orbited around the more famous killing, while the missionaries themselves remained at the edge of the public record. 4 Americans whose names most people have never heard. Their story doesn't fit neatly into the framework that most people carry when they think about cartel violence and Americans. The missionaries weren't DEA agents. They weren't informants. They weren't border residents living in the shadow of a drug war. They were a pair of married couples from Nevada and California who had traveled south to do what they believed was good work, knocking on doors in a city they had come to love, going about the most ordinary imaginable version of their lives, right up until the moment they knocked on the wrong one. Pat Romero has kept a photograph of her brother Benjamin through all of it. She was living in Ely, Nevada, when reporters came to speak with her in 2018, still holding that photograph, still repeating the same basic demand that someone in some official capacity finally explain what happened to 4 Americans who disappeared from a city in western Mexico on December 2nd, 1984, and were never seen again. The photograph shows a young man who had his whole life in front of him. He was 29 years old. His wife was 27. The other couple, Dennis and Rose Carlson, had driven across from Redding, California, to join their friends in a city all 4 of them believed offered something worth going door to door for. They were killed for knocking. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The cartel's killing spree in Guadalajara wasn't finished. 8 weeks after the missionaries were buried in an unmarked grave, 2 more Americans entered the city, a novelist finishing his book and a friend stopping in for a visit. They walked into a restaurant for dinner and never walked out. Section 2. John Walker and Alberto Radelat. John Walker was born in Washington, D.C. in 1948 and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 1968. The kind of year when that decision meant something very specific about where a person was likely to end up. He ended up in Vietnam. He was wounded twice in combat there, badly enough on both occasions to earn 2 Purple Hearts, and he came home carrying whatever Vietnam put inside the men who fought it. He used the GI Bill to attend the University of Minnesota, where he earned a degree in journalism in 1976. Then he spent the years that followed doing what journalism graduates with small paper careers do, working as a reporter and photographer at modest publications across Minnesota and Iowa, building bylines, covering local stories, paying the rent. He married a woman named Eve. They had 2 daughters, Lanny and Keely. By the early 1980s, Walker had a family, a career, and a quiet life in Minnesota, and somewhere underneath all of it, he had a novel he wanted to write. Writers who want to write a novel but haven't yet tend to carry it around with them the way other people carry unfinished business. For Walker, the novel was a long-standing project he could not fully pursue while working full-time at a newspaper. In 1983, he made a decision. He and Eve and the 2 girls relocated to Guadalajara, Mexico, for what was planned as a sabbatical year, a period where Walker could write without the competing demands of a newsroom job pulling him in the other direction. Guadalajara, in 1983, was, for a journalist with an eye for complicated stories, an extraordinary place to be. The city was beautiful and warm, and if Walker was paying attention to the world around him, he could not have missed what was happening in the drug trade flowing through the city's back channels. His family remembered him as easygoing, funny about his own limitations with the Spanish language, and completely committed to finishing his book. The girls loved the life they had there. One of Walker's daughters would later describe the family's time in Guadalajara as paradise. The sabbatical year ended, and the family's circumstances shifted. Eve Walker took the 2 daughters and returned to Minnesota. Walker stayed behind. He wasn't finished with the book, and he wasn't prepared to leave without it. So while his wife and daughters went home, he remained in Guadalajara through 1984 and into the early weeks of 1985, working through the final stretch of a project he had put years of his life into. Alberto Radelat traveled to Guadalajara in December of 1984 to visit his friend. Radelat was a young man from Fort Worth, Texas, a dental student, and he and Walker had a friendship that had survived distance and time in the way that good friendships do. Coming to Guadalajara was a chance to spend time with a person he genuinely wanted to see, in a city that Walker had described to him with the kind of affection that makes people want to experience a place for themselves. Radelat arrived, and the 2 settled into the easy rhythm of friends reuniting after a separation, the kind of time where nothing much is planned, and that's exactly the point. By January of 1985, Walker was reportedly close to finishing his novel and preparing to return to Minnesota. The trip back was coming. According to accounts from people who knew him and from reporting on the case, the evening of January 30th was meant to celebrate that, or at least to mark it in the way that 2 friends in a foreign city might, by going out for a good meal together. The restaurant they chose was called La Langosta. In English, the name means the lobster. It was a high-end seafood restaurant in Guadalajara, a place that, by every outward appearance, was exactly the kind of establishment where 2 men could sit down, order dinner, and spend the evening talking about the future. They arrived at around 7 in the evening. What they walked into was not a public dining room open for the night. The restaurant had been cleared for a private party, the kind that powerful men in Guadalajara arranged by making clear that whatever other plans a restaurant had were no longer relevant. The party belonged to Rafael Caro Quintero, the head of the Guadalajara cartel's marijuana operations, and one of the three men who ran the most powerful drug trafficking organization in western Mexico. Fonseca Carrillo was there too, along with a collection of cartel members and associates who had been drinking and occupying the space for hours. The group at that table controlled a criminal organization that had just lost billions of dollars in a single government raid 2 months earlier. They were operating in a state of sustained, barely contained paranoia about who might be working against them, and into that room walked 2 American men who had not done their research on what the restaurant had become that evening. The court record that would eventually be produced from the American criminal proceedings connected to this case describes what happened next with precision. Soon after Walker and Radelat entered, they were grabbed by 10 to 15 members of the cartel and beaten with fists and guns. They were dragged to a storage room in the back of the restaurant while the beating continued. There, they were tortured with ice picks. The interrogation had one central question: who were they, and why had they come into the restaurant? Neither Walker nor Radelat had any connection to the DEA. Neither had any involvement in drug enforcement or law enforcement of any kind. Walker was a journalist and aspiring novelist from Minnesota. Radelat was a dental student from Texas. The court record notes that neither man had any apparent association with the DEA or with any drug-related activities, a line that carries its own awful weight when read against what was being done to them in that back room. The torture produced what torture often produces under those circumstances: a statement. One of the 2 men, under sustained extreme violence, said something that could be interpreted as an admission that they were police. It was not true. It was the kind of thing a person says when the pain of not saying it becomes unbearable, when saying anything seems better than continuing the alternative. Cartel men in that storage room heard it as confirmation of what they already believed. These 2 Americans, who had walked into the wrong restaurant at the wrong hour, had now been forced into the role that had been assigned to them from the moment someone looked at their unfamiliar faces and decided they must be government. Walker died in that back room. The forensic accounting of exactly how he died has varied across sources over the years, with some accounts describing blunt force trauma to the head and others referencing what Godoy, the witness from Section 1, described as a direct act by El Chapo. What the physical evidence confirmed was that Walker did not survive the night. Radelat, according to the available accounts, was still alive when both men were wrapped in tablecloths, loaded into a vehicle, and driven out of the city in the early hours of January 31st. The bodies were taken to a park called San Isidro Mazatepec in Zapopan, near Guadalajara, and buried there. The men who had tortured them drove back into the city, and the next morning, one of the cartel members involved, a man named Javier Vázquez Velasco, informed a cartel associate that both of the tourists were dead. The disappearance of Walker and Radelat was not initially understood for what it was. Eve Walker received a call from the State Department telling her that her husband and his friend had vanished. They had last been seen entering a restaurant in Guadalajara. There was no body, no crime scene open to foreign investigators, no immediate path to answers in a city where the cartel's reach extended into law enforcement and where the appetite to investigate the murders of 2 American civilians was limited by exactly the kind of corruption that protected the men responsible. Walker's daughters, still young when their father disappeared, grew up inside that absence. Lanny Walker would later say that she and her sister had lost nearly 40 years with their father and that nothing could make up for that. The bodies were not found until June of 1985, nearly 5 months after the night at La Langosta. Mexican police unearthed the remains wrapped in carpet at the park in Zapopan, and the physical evidence confirmed what investigators already suspected. The tablecloth material was analyzed against what had come from the restaurant. The bodies had been in the ground through the full span of the investigation that followed Camarena's kidnapping and murder, the massive Operation Leyenda that brought enormous pressure down on the Guadalajara cartel in early 1985. And yet the resolution of Walker and Radelat's specific case lagged behind. The prosecution of the men responsible fell unevenly. The most significant American legal action for the Walker and Radelat murders centered on Vasquez Velasco, who was arrested in Los Angeles and tried in federal court. A grand jury had indicted 19 people connected to the cartel on various charges from 1984 and 1985, and Walker and Radelat's murders were among the specific counts. Prosecutors argued at trial that the murders were part of a pattern of retaliatory acts by the Guadalajara cartel against Americans the organization believed to be DEA agents or agents of the American government. The legal theory was significant. American courts were asserting that they could reach crimes committed entirely on Mexican soil against American citizens because those crimes were part of a deliberate assault on U.S. law enforcement efforts and, by extension, on U.S. national interests. The jury agreed. Vasquez Velasco was convicted on 2 counts tied directly to the murders of Walker and Radelat and sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison. He remained in federal custody in the years that followed. Caro Quintero was a different story. He was convicted in Mexico for the Camarena murder and served 28 years of a 40-year sentence before an appeals court freed him in 2013 on a technical legal argument about which court had jurisdiction to try him. When that ruling came down, the charges connected to Walker and Radelat's deaths were among those formally dismissed in the same process. Eve Walker received the news the way she had received all the news about her husband's case over the years, as another blow in a sequence that had never fully resolved. Walker's daughters, Lani and Keely, went public with their grief and their demands. When Caro Quintero was recaptured by Mexican forces in 2022, Lani Walker told reporters that the capture had brought real relief and real trauma at the same time. The family had lost decades with the man who was supposed to come home from Mexico and bring a finished novel with him, and a new arrest was not the same thing as justice, even if it was closer to it than anything that had come before. When Caro Quintero was extradited to the United States in February of 2025 and arraigned in Brooklyn, the charges he faced focused primarily on Camarena's murder and the broader drug trafficking enterprise. Walker's daughters and their representatives were among the voices pushing for their father's name to be formally included in the American case. Whether that happens, and what form any additional accountability takes, remains part of a legal process that has been moving slowly for 40 years and has not yet arrived at a conclusion that Walker's family would describe as complete. Walker's novel was never published. His daughters kept copies of the manuscript. The book he had stayed behind in Guadalajara to finish exists, but only for the people who loved him, a private record of the project that cost him his life when a cartel boss looked across a restaurant and decided that a tired American writer finishing his dinner was a threat worth destroying. Radelat, whose name appears in fewer accounts and whose family's public statements are less documented in the available record, deserves the same straightforward accounting. He was a young man from Fort Worth who traveled to Mexico to visit a friend and walked into a private cartel party in a seafood restaurant without knowing it was there. He was tortured for hours and buried in a park outside the city. He was 33 years old. No amount of legal outcome changes the specific arithmetic of that night. 2 men who had done nothing to anyone stepped through the wrong door at 7 in the evening and were dead before the sun came up the next morning. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The killings in Guadalajara in 1984 and 1985 happened inside a cartel's spiral of rage and paranoia, directed at anyone who might be an American agent. The next case moves forward 24 years to a very different kind of confrontation, one where the American involved wasn't mistaken for a government spy, but was instead the one who had looked a cartel in the eye and told an entire community to fight back. Section 3. Benjamin LeBaron, 2009. Benjamin Franklin LeBaron. Ray was born on October 4, 1976, into the extended LeBaron family that had been putting down roots in the desert valleys of Chihuahua, Mexico, for generations. He held dual citizenship, American and Mexican, as most members of his community did. He lived in a sprawling new stucco house in a town called Galeana, near Colonia Lebaron, with his wife Miriam and their 5 young children. He farmed pecans and worked the trade networks between Mexico and the United States that had sustained his family and neighbors for decades. He was the bishop of his local church. Everyone called him Benji. The community he came from had been built over roughly 60 years by a Mormon patriarch named Alma Dea Lebaron, who had moved a breakaway religious settlement into the Chihuahua valleys with a specific vision of what life there could look like. The desert, planted with pecan orchards, families building something durable and self-sufficient in a landscape that rewarded hard work and punished everything else. By the time Benjamin was grown and raising his own children, that vision had largely been realized. Colonia Lebaron had about 1,000 residents who farmed large tracts of land, drove new pickup trucks, and lived in the kind of houses that stood out visibly against the poverty of the surrounding region. The community was not affiliated with the mainstream Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and had moved well past the polygamist practices of its founding generations. It was, by most outward measures, a quiet, prosperous, close-knit settlement of families who happened to straddle the border between 2 countries in a way that had mostly served them well. What was also true by the summer of 2009 was that Chihuahua was no longer quiet. The Juarez Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel were in the middle of a bloody territorial war for control of the smuggling corridors that ran through the state and across the border into Texas and New Mexico. Ciudad Juarez, the border city just north of where the Lebaron community lived, was already one of the most violent places on earth. Over 1,000 people had been killed there in that year alone, and the violence was spreading outward from the city into the surrounding region in ways that had not happened before. Extortion calls were coming in to community phones. Kidnapping attempts had increased. People who had lived in Chihuahua their entire lives were beginning to understand that the rules governing who could be targeted and for what had changed in ways that were hard to fully absorb. In May of 2009, the reality of that change arrived at the Lebaron family's door directly. Benjamin's younger brother Eric, who was 16 years old, was abducted with a younger sibling from a family ranch in the mountains near Colonia Lebaron by a group of armed men. The younger boy was released almost immediately to carry a message to the family. The kidnappers wanted $1 million. If the family paid, Eric would come home. If they didn't, the outcome would be different. Benjamin Lebaron looked at that demand and made a decision. The family was not going to pay, and they were not going to stay quiet about it either. What followed was something that Mexico's drug cartels rarely encountered from ordinary civilians: organized, public resistance. Benjamin led a caravan of roughly 500 people, gathered from the Lebaron community and from neighboring Mennonite settlements and mainstream Mormon families in the area, to the office of the Chihuahua state governor to demand that the government do something about what was happening to their communities. The image of 500 people from multiple religious traditions converging on a government office to publicly name a kidnapping and demand accountability was striking in a state where most victims of cartel violence stayed silent out of fear of making things worse. The governor sent army troops into the mountains to search for Eric. 8 days after he had been taken, his kidnappers simply told him to go home. There was no ransom paid. Eric walked out of captivity on his own 2 feet, and the family's refusal to comply with the demand had worked, at least in the most basic sense of getting him back. Benjamin did not take that outcome as a sign that the threat had passed. He took it as a starting point. In the weeks that followed, he helped found an advocacy group called SOS Chihuahua, from the Spanish name Sociedad Organizada Segura, which translates roughly as Secure Organized Society. The group's stated mission was to organize citizens to defend themselves, report crimes, push for proper law enforcement responses, and hold the government accountable for the violence spreading through the region. It was exactly the kind of organized civilian pressure campaign that cartel organizations counted on not existing, because the threat of retribution was usually sufficient to keep communities fragmented and silent. Benjamin chose not to be silent. He gave interviews to local media. He stood in front of a graduating class of police cadets and spoke about what the community was living through. He staged public rallies. He was on the radio. He was in the newspapers. His name and face became associated, in the Chihuahua media and in the national coverage that followed, with the idea that ordinary people in cartel territory did not have to accept the violence being done around them as simply the condition of their lives. The Juarez cartel noticed the pattern of events in the 2 months between Eric's release in May and July 7th was not random. Another member of the broader community, a 72-year-old bishop named Meredith Romney, was abducted not long after Eric came home. Romney was released after his family paid a ransom. The cartel had not changed its approach. It had simply moved to a softer target. But the broader environment in the Galeana area had shifted in ways that were increasingly dangerous for anyone who had publicly aligned themselves against the cartel's freedom to operate. Benjamin continued anyway. His brother Julian later described Benjamin's thinking as rooted in a belief that the only way to survive what was happening in Chihuahua was to refuse to be afraid of it, or at least to act in spite of the fear. Julian said that Benjamin believed ordinary people had more power than they realized, if they would only choose to use it. On the night of July 7th, 2009, 4 trucks of men were recorded on video passing through a highway toll booth outside Galeana. They were dressed in camouflage, in the kind of military-style gear that cartel groups across Mexico had adopted specifically to blur the line between themselves and the security forces they were simultaneously corrupting and avoiding. The trucks drove to Benjamin LeBaron's house. About 10 armed men came into the home. What they did next, they did in front of Benjamin's wife and children. They beat him. They tied his hands together. They dragged him out of the house and pushed him into one of the trucks. 5 young children watched their father taken from his own home by men with guns. Luis Carlos Widmar Stubbs, who was 29 years old and Benjamin's brother-in-law, lived nearby. He heard the noise coming from Benjamin's house and ran to see what was happening. By the time he got there, he could see exactly what was happening. He chose to help anyway. The men who had come for Benjamin turned their attention to Widmar as well. He was beaten and put into a truck alongside Benjamin, and the convoy drove away from the house and out into the night. The 2 men were found that same morning in a cemetery outside of town. They had been beaten and shot in the back of the head. A message had been left behind for the community that had produced Benjamin LeBaron's activism. The note said, in rough translation, that this was for the leaders of LeBaron who had not believed and who now believed. The family was devastated, but they did not collapse into silence, at least not the permanent kind. Julian LeBaron, in the days after his brother's death, told a reporter that the LeBaron community would not be ending what Benjamin had started. If they killed one leader, Julian said, others would take his place. The community had not been broken by this. It had, if anything, been clarified. Mexico's anti-crime activists and civil society organizations cited the killing of Benjamin LeBaron as a watershed moment in the national conversation about cartel violence, describing it as the first time that a civilian organizer had been killed, specifically as retaliation for anti-crime advocacy, rather than for anything connected to the drug trade itself. The man Mexican authorities identified as responsible was José Rodolfo Escajeda, known by the nickname El Riquín, described by investigators as one of the bloodiest hitmen operating in Chihuahua and a lieutenant and key operational figure in the Juarez cartel. Escajeda had a long history with American law enforcement as well. A federal grand jury in the Western District of Texas had indicted him as far back as 2006 on marijuana and cocaine trafficking charges related to his control of drug corridors near Ciudad Juarez. He was also suspected of ordering the massacre of 18 patients at a drug rehabilitation center in Juarez in September of 2009, which is ultimately how Mexican soldiers tracked him down. Mexican army forces arrested Escajeda in early September of 2009, catching him in Nuevo Casas Grandes, Chihuahua, as he and 3 other suspects rode in bullet-resistant vehicles. The timing of his arrest, just 2 months after Benjamin's murder, and the fact that he was captured in part because of the attention his criminal activity had attracted from a military presence that had been sent to the region, in part because of the Lebaran community's activism, carried a certain grim irony. Escajeda was extradited to the United States in December of 2010 to face the drug trafficking charges that had been pending since 2006. He pleaded guilty in 2011 and received a sentence of 35 years in federal prison. The charges against him in the American court were drug charges, not murder charges, because the murders had taken place on Mexican soil and the American indictment predated the killings. Benjamin's death was documented in the American extradition record as part of the broader case against Escajeda, but it was not the charge that carried the prison sentence. Benjamin Lebaran was 32 years old when he died. He left behind his wife Miriam and 5 children, the oldest of whom was still very young. Julian Lebaran, who had spent the months after his brother's death trying to hold together both the community and the public advocacy that Benjamin had started, later reflected that SOS Chihuahua's most significant failure had been to stop its momentum after the killing, rather than press forward with even greater intensity. The organization continued in some form, but without a single unifying figure, it never fully recovered its public visibility. Julian joined a national peace movement in 2011, founded by the Mexican poet Javier Cecilia, taking Benjamin's unfinished work into a larger arena. The Lebaran family's history with cartel violence did not end in 2009. The community that Benjamin had tried to organize and protect would remain in the crosshairs of armed organizations operating in northern Mexico for the decade that followed. A different and far larger massacre involving Lebaran family members in a different state would land on front pages around the world in 2019, and the names of the women and children killed in that attack would, for many readers, be their first introduction to a family and a community that had already been living at the edge of cartel violence for years before that morning arrived. What Benjamin Lebaran's case represents, stripped of everything else, is something that does not appear in any of the other cases in this list. He was not in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was not an accidental casualty of a cartel's paranoia or a robbery crew's recklessness. He was not mistaken for someone else. He went to a government office with 500 of his neighbors and demanded accountability for a kidnapping, and then he kept going when the first effort succeeded, and then he gave interviews, and then he staged rallies, and then he gave speeches to police cadets, and the cartel decided that a man willing to do all of that was more dangerous to them than anything else they were facing in Chihuahua that summer. They were probably right. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Benjamin Lebaran was killed for choosing to stand up openly against the cartel in his own community. The next case moves to the water, to a lake on the Texas border, where a couple on jet skis crossed into Mexican territory to take photographs of a sunken church, and only one of them made it back. Section 4. David Hartley. David Hartley was 30 years old and had no reason to think the afternoon was going to be anything other than a good one. He and his wife Tiffany had been out on Falcon Lake once already that season, just a month earlier in August, and they had loved it. The lake straddles the Texas-Mexico border for roughly 60 miles along the Rio Grande, and on the American side, it was exactly the kind of open water that made a Saturday feel like it was working the way Saturdays are supposed to. They were living in McAllen, Texas at the time, relocated there by David's company from Reynosa, Mexico, after the violence in that border city had grown too serious to ignore. They were planning to move back to Colorado before the year was out, September 30th was meant to be one last run on the lake before they packed up and left, with a specific destination in mind. On the Mexican side, a half-submerged church in the ruins of a flooded town called Old Guerrero, the kind of image that looks like nothing else and that David wanted to photograph before they drove north for good. It was the most ordinary kind of plan. It was also the last one he would make. By 2010, work had taken them to the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, near the border. David's company had originally stationed him in Reynosa, a border city in the Mexican state of Tamaulipas, but the violence there had grown severe enough that the company moved him across the river to McAllen, Texas, for safety. From McAllen, the border was right there, a constant presence rather than an abstract concept. The couple had been together for 8 years by then, and they had built a life that made room for the outdoors. They had taken up scuba diving. They owned a pair of Sea-Doo personal watercraft, the kind of machines that turn an ordinary lake into something worth getting up early for. In early August of 2010, they discovered Falcon Lake. The lake is a dammed section of the Rio Grande, stretching roughly 60 miles along the Texas-Mexico border, with American territory on one side and the Mexican state of Tamaulipas on the other. Fishermen had been using it for decades, drawn by the bass fishing that made it one of the more popular spots along that stretch of border. The Hartleys went out on their Sea-Doos and loved it. They came back, by late September, with a move back to Colorado coming and the kind of window of good weather that closes quickly in that part of the country. They decided to go one more time. There was something specific David wanted to photograph on this last trip: a church. The town of Old Guerrero, known in Spanish as Viejo Guerrero, sits on the Mexican side of Falcon Lake, beneath the water. When the Rio Grande was dammed in the 1950s to create the lake, the town was flooded and its residents relocated. All that remains visible of Old Guerrero is the top portion of the church that served the community, rising out of the surface of the lake like a ruin that refused to fully disappear. The image of that half-submerged steeple draws sightseers and photographers who cross into Mexican waters to get close to it, and David Hartley had seen pictures of it and wanted his own. It was the kind of thing a young man with a camera and a Sea-Doo would think to do on a clear September day when he and his wife had the afternoon free and an open lake in front of them. On the morning of September 30th, 2010, David and Tiffany loaded their Sea-Doos onto their trailer and drove towards Zapata, Texas, the town on the American side where they would put in. On the way there, a Texas Highway Patrol officer pulled them over because the trailer had expired tags. The stop was recorded on the officer's dashboard camera. He asked where they were heading. David told him they were going jet skiing for the day, or maybe just a little while. The officer let them go. A few hours later, a different recording would capture Tiffany's voice in a very different kind of conversation. What the Hartleys did not know, and what an intelligence analysis produced by Stratfor after the shooting would later lay out in detail, was that they were driving toward a lake that was anything but peaceful on its Mexican side. Falcon Lake sat in the middle of active Zeta Cartel territory. The Los Zetas organization and the Gulf Cartel were in the middle of a brutal territorial war for control of the smuggling corridors that ran through northeastern Tamaulipas, and the Mexican side of the lake had become a significant operational area for that conflict. Law enforcement officials on the American side had documented multiple incidents in which armed men in boats had approached, threatened, and in some cases robbed American fishermen working near the far shore. Warnings had been issued to boaters about the Mexican side of the lake. Some people heeded those warnings. David and Tiffany Hartley had not come across them, or had not fully understood what they meant. The truck they were driving that day had Tamaulipas state plates, which was not unusual for someone who had been living and working across the border. They launched their Sea-Doos, crossed into Mexican waters, and rode out to Old Guerrero. They took photographs. According to Tiffany's account, they walked on the steps of the sunken church and photographed it from close up, enjoying a spot that felt remote and beautiful and unlike anything they could easily find on the American side of the lake. Then they turned around and began heading back toward Texas. What happened next took minutes from start to finish. About 5 minutes into the return trip, 3 speedboats came toward them. Tiffany later told investigators there was 1 boat on their left and 2 to their right. The boats came up fast, and the men inside them opened fire. David Hartley was shot in the back of the head. The bullet killed him almost immediately. He fell or was thrown from his Sea-Doo and landed in the water. Tiffany was close enough to see what had happened and to understand what it meant. She tried to pull her husband onto her watercraft and could not manage it. The bullets were still hitting the water around her. She made the decision that the only way either of them had any chance was for her to ride as fast as she could back toward the American side, and that is what she did. She reached American soil and called 911. Her voice on that call, which was released to the media in the days that followed, captured the moment of shock and grief with a rawness that the recording could not soften. She told the dispatcher that David had been thrown from his Sea-Doo and that she had not been able to pick him up. She asked for help. Blood samples taken from her life jacket were analyzed by investigators and supported what she told them. The dashboard camera footage of the traffic stop on the way to the lake showed David alive and relaxed, answering a state trooper's question a few hours before his wife was on the phone, saying his name with that particular quality in her voice. David's body was never found. His Sea-Doo was never recovered. Mexican authorities, who had jurisdiction over the side of the lake where the shooting occurred, launched a search. They brought in divers. They dragged sections of the lake. They came up with nothing. The area where he went into the water was deep and in a part of the lake that the Zetas treated as their operational territory, and Mexican investigators working in that region understood very clearly what it meant to make too much visible progress on a case the cartel did not want solved. The man leading the Mexican investigation on the Tamaulipas side was a commander named Rolando Armando Flores Villegas, the head of state investigators in the border city of Ciudad Miguel Alemán. A few days after he handed documents to a Texas television station that named 2 Zeta cartel members as suspects in the shooting, his head was delivered to the Mexican military in a suitcase. The Tamaulipas State Prosecutor's Office stated that Flores's death was unrelated to the investigation. No one who followed the case closely found that explanation persuasive. The search for David Hartley on the Mexican side came to a practical halt after that. The Stratfor analysis that circulated in the weeks after the shooting offered what investigators and the Zapata County Sheriff's Office considered a plausible explanation for why the Hartleys had been attacked. The truck they had driven to the lake that morning had Tamaulipas state plates, which was a detail that would have registered to anyone keeping watch on the activity around the lake that day. They had ridden their Sea-Doos directly toward the old Guerrero area, which Zapata County Sheriff Sigifredo Gonzalez later confirmed was being used at the time as a staging point for drug shipments moving across the lake. An island near the church was reportedly being used as a waypoint for marijuana in transit. Given the couple's apparent direction of travel and their plates, Stratfor's analysts concluded it was possible that Zeta's scouts watching the lake had identified them as Gulf Cartel surveillance, sent into the area to gather intelligence on Zeta operations before an attack. Under that interpretation, the speedboats were not random piracy. They were a calculated response to what the cartel believed was reconnaissance. If that reading was correct, then David Hartley died because 2 people on personal watercraft happened to ride in the direction of a drug shipment staging point on a day when Zeta enforcers were watching for exactly that kind of approach. He had no connection to the Gulf Cartel. He had no connection to any cartel. He was a 30-year-old man from Colorado who had driven to a border lake to take pictures of a church before moving back home. American investigators later determined that the gunmen who attacked the couple had received authorization from their cartel to kill Tiffany as well. She escaped because her Sea-Doo was fast enough and she was already moving when the bullets hit the water around her. The same intelligence that established this detail named suspects in the attack. Mexican authorities eventually publicly identified two brothers, Juan Pedro Saldivar Farias and Jose Manuel Saldivar Farias, both members of the Zetas and both from New Guerrero, a town near the old Guerrero ruins where the Hartleys had been photographing the church. In October of 2012, the Mexican Navy detained a senior Zetas regional leader named Salvador Alfonso Martinez Escobedo, known by the nickname El Ardilla, which means the squirrel. He was publicly presented as a suspect in Hartley's death, along with the 2010 massacre of 72 migrants in Tamaulipas, one of the worst mass atrocities committed by the cartel during those years. His detention marked the first time that a person had been publicly named and taken into custody in connection with David Hartley's killing. Tiffany Hartley spent the years after the shooting doing something that took sustained will. She kept talking. She testified before Congress at a field hearing in Brownsville, Texas, where she told lawmakers that the men who murdered David were right across the river, not in Afghanistan or Iraq, but in the literal backyard of the United States, and that the cartel was killing anyone who got in its way. She sued the State Department, the Justice Department, and the FBI in an effort to compel answers about what the government knew and what it had done to find David's killers. She gave countless media interviews. She appeared at memorials. She wore the specific expression of a person carrying something permanent. David's father, Dennis Hartley, told a journalist that he had come to believe Falcon Lake would be his son's headstone. No grave, no recovered remains, no body to bring home and bury. A fisherman found unidentified skeletal remains on the Mexican side of the lake the following year, about 15 miles from where David was last seen, but the remains were never confirmed to be his. David Hartley was 30 years old when he died. He had been jet skiing on a border lake on a clear afternoon in September, taking pictures of a church under the water, planning to move to Colorado before the year was out. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. David Hartley was killed by men who had decided he was something he was not. The next case follows a remarkably similar logic, also in 2010, when three people who had spent a Saturday afternoon at a children's birthday party were followed home through the streets of Ciudad Juarez and shot because a cartel hit squad decided their cars matched the wrong profile. Section 5. The Ciudad Juarez Consulate Attack. Leslie Ann Enriquez worked at the United States Consulate in Ciudad Juarez, a posting that in 2010 required a certain steadiness that not everyone possessed, because Juarez was in the middle of the worst sustained period of violence in its modern history. Her job there involved providing basic services to American citizens in Mexico, the everyday consular work of helping people navigate bureaucracy in a foreign country. She was 35 years old, from El Paso, Texas, just across the border from the consulate, where she spent her working days. She was 4 months pregnant. She had a husband and a baby daughter who had not yet reached her first birthday. Arthur Redelfs was 34 years old and worked on the American side of the border as a detention officer with the El Paso County Sheriff's Department. He and Leslie lived in El Paso, and the routine of their married life moved between two cities the way that border life often does, with one foot in each country and the bridge between them as ordinary as a commute. On a Saturday in March, that routine brought them both into Ciudad Juarez for the kind of occasion that makes the ordinary feel solid and good. A children's birthday party, the kind with food and cake and games, and small children who don't yet know that the city they are celebrating in is one of the most dangerous places on earth. To understand what Ciudad Juarez had become by the spring of 2010, it helps to look at a single number. More than 2,600 people had been killed in the city in 2009 alone. That figure made Juarez one of the most lethal cities in the world, a designation that had arrived because the Juarez Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel, led at the time by Joaquin Guzman, were engaged in a brutal war for control of the drug trafficking routes that ran through the city and across the border into El Paso. The Juarez Cartel had a paramilitary enforcement wing called La Línea, and allied with them was a gang that had started in American prisons in the late 1980s and grown, over the following 2 decades, into a transnational criminal organization with its own hierarchy of captains, lieutenants, sergeants, and soldiers operating on both sides of the border. That gang was called Barrio Azteca. Barrio Azteca's alliance with the Juarez Cartel had a specific purpose: to hold the drug trafficking routes through Juarez, known inside the cartel world as the Juarez Plaza, against the Sinaloa organization's attempts to take them. The routes mattered because they were one of the most valuable corridors for moving drugs into the United States, and the battle to control them had turned Juarez into a city where armed men in trucks operated in daylight with a confidence that came from understanding that the consequences for violence were limited by the scale of the corruption around them. Barrio Azteca's structure gave it the ability to dispatch coordinated hit squads on short notice, the kind of operation that required leadership, communication, and personnel who had been trained to move and shoot and disappear. By 2010, the gang had made itself useful to the cartel precisely because it could do all three. The birthday party on March 13th took place at a location connected to the consulate community in Juarez, attended by consulate employees and their families who had gathered in the way that people working far from home often do on weekends, building something resembling the ordinary social life that their postings had complicated. The Texas Observer's detailed reconstruction of the day describes 2 Barrio Azteca hit teams positioned outside the party's location, watching as guests departed. The call that had brought them there had come days in advance. A Barrio Azteca leader had ordered one of his men to find out where consulate employees were holding a children's party and to follow the white SUV belonging to Red Elves. That instruction, placed days before the party, means that what happened when Leslie and Arthur pulled away from the gathering that afternoon was not spontaneous. It had been planned. What is less clear, even after more than a decade of prosecution, is precisely why that planning was set in motion. One arrested Barrio Azteca member, Jesus Ernesto Chavez, who identified himself as a leader of the hit operation, claimed that Leslie had helped a rival gang obtain American visas and that the killings were ordered in retaliation for that assistance. American officials investigated that claim thoroughly and found nothing to support it. Leslie worked in a consular section that provided basic services to American citizens. She was not in any position to provide visas. The U.S. Embassy stated clearly that no evidence of corruption had been found. The federal trial that ultimately convicted the 2 gunmen rested on a simpler and, in some ways, more disturbing explanation. The hit teams had followed the vehicles leaving the birthday party and attacked them because they had been mistaken for vehicles belonging to rival gang members. 3 people died, and one of the most documented explanations for why it happened is that the men who killed them had the wrong cars. Ricardo Valles de la Rosa, an Azteca member arrested in the days after the attack, gave investigators a detailed account. He said he had followed Redelf's white Toyota SUV as it drove away from the birthday party, trailing it through Juarez streets until the men assigned as shooters confirmed they had the vehicle in their sights. At that point, he was told to fall back. He did. Moments later, he heard shooting. He drove past the scene and saw the result. As Leslie and Arthur's white Toyota SUV moved through the city in the direction of El Paso, the hit team's vehicle came up alongside it, near the Juarez City Hall. It was broad daylight on a Saturday afternoon. Witnesses watched the SUV take gunfire and drift. Leslie was shot twice in the head. Arthur was shot as he tried to steer the car toward the American border and escape. According to the civil complaint later filed by the family, Arthur made a desperate attempt to reach the Stanton Street Bridge, which connects Juarez to El Paso, and was gunned down before he could get there. The white Toyota drifted to a stop near the bridge entrance. Inside the back seat, their infant daughter sat unhurt in her car seat, surrounded by the aftermath of what had just happened to her parents. Simultaneous with this, a second hit team was following a separate vehicle that had also left the birthday party. Jorge Alberto Salcido Ceniceros, a 37-year-old Mexican citizen whose wife worked at the consulate, was killed in that second attack. Two of his children who were riding with him were wounded. His wife had been traveling in a different car and survived. The two attacks were carried out in coordination by separate teams against what the gang had identified as two vehicles departing a gathering of people connected to the American consulate. The investigation that followed was extensive. American law enforcement agencies, working alongside Mexican counterparts, began building a case against the individuals responsible almost immediately. The sheer visibility of the attack, carried out in a city that already had the attention of American officials and journalists covering the border violence, and the fact that the victims included an American consulate employee and a pregnant woman whose baby survived in the back seat, meant the political pressure to identify and prosecute everyone involved was significant and sustained. A superseding indictment eventually charged 35 defendants connected to the Barrio Azteca organization and the consulate murders. That indictment covered not only the killings themselves, but a broader pattern of racketeering, narcotics trafficking, money laundering, and murder that the gang had carried out in Juarez over a sustained period. Prosecutors pursued the case across multiple years and jurisdictions, seeking extradition from Mexico for defendants who had fled or been captured there. The two men identified at trial as the direct gunmen were Jose Guadalupe Diaz, 43 years old, known by the nickname Zorro, and Martin Perez Marufo, 54, known as Popeye. Both were from Chihuahua, Mexico. The evidence at trial established that Diaz had shot and killed Leslie and Arthur, and that Marufo had killed Salcido Ceniceros in the separate simultaneous attack. A 13-day trial in federal court in El Paso, in the courtroom of U.S. District Judge Kathleen Cardone, resulted in their conviction on all counts in February of 2022, more than 11 years after the afternoon of the birthday party. Both men were sentenced to life in prison in October of 2022. Of the 35 defendants charged in the broader Barrio Azteca indictment connected to this case, all were eventually apprehended. The last of them, a man named Luis Mendez, was captured in 2020, ending a manhunt that had stretched for a decade. The man identified as having directed the overall operation, Eduardo Ravello, known by the nickname Tablas, had been a high-ranking Barrio Azteca captain who monitored radio communications and directed the hit teams during the consulate murders. He ended up on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list and spent years in Mexico evading capture. He was arrested in July of 2018. He was extradited to the United States in February of 2025, and in December of 2025, he pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy, conspiracy to commit murder in a foreign country, and murder in aid of racketeering. He faces a mandatory sentence of life in prison. The baby daughter of Leslie and Arthur Redelfs was in the back seat of the white Toyota SUV when both of her parents were shot to death in front of the Stanton Street Bridge. She was not hurt. She was taken into the care of consular officials that same day. What had been an ordinary Saturday afternoon for a young El Paso family, the kind of afternoon that involves a birthday party and the drive home afterward, ended with two dead parents, an orphaned infant, a car full of bullet holes near the bridge to America, and a city so saturated with cartel violence that the attack barely registered as extraordinary in the news cycle of that particular March. Leslie had posted something on her Facebook page in January, a few weeks before she died, the kind of brief, everyday expression that people put on social media without giving it a second thought. She wrote that she could not wait to go to bed, punctuated with exclamation points, the exhausted cheerfulness of a woman who was pregnant and working and living a full, tiring life. In the days after the shooting, people in her Facebook network began replacing their own profile pictures with black squares. It was the kind of gesture that says something was lost here, even if the words for it are hard to find. Juarez City Hall, where the attack began, the Stanton Street Bridge, where Arthur ran out of road, the back seat of a white Toyota SUV. These are the geography of an afternoon that produced 3 deaths: 1 orphaned infant, 2 children wounded in a second car, and a years-long prosecution that eventually put the gunman in front of an El Paso jury more than a decade after the birthday cake had been eaten and the guests had started going home. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The birthday party attack happened in a city that had become an open battlefield. The next case moves to an empty stretch of highway in Tamaulipas, where a missionary couple who had spent 30 years crossing in and out of Mexico came upon a cartel roadblock, and only one of them made it back across the border alive. Section 6. Nancy Davis. Sam and Nancy Davis had been crossing into Mexico for 38 years by the time the cartel found them on that highway in Tamaulipas. 38 years of border crossings in pickup trucks, loaded with whatever the village churches they had built needed that month. 38 years of roads that got worse the further south they drove, of remote communities where they had delivered babies and buried members of congregations they had known for decades. Sam called his wife Nans. He described her, speaking to reporters 2 weeks after she died, as perfect. The word came out simply, without decoration, the way a person describes something so fundamental to their experience of life that elaborating on it would only reduce it. They were from Monte Alto, Texas, a small town in the remote lower Rio Grande Valley, and they had built what amounted to a second life across the border, establishing village churches in communities in Tamaulipas, Mexico, and showing up regularly to support the local pastors who ran them. The work they did was the quiet, sustained kind that does not generate news coverage under normal circumstances, driving into Mexico, paying pastors who served tiny congregations, checking on the churches, driving home. Their son Joseph, who had grown up watching this rhythm play out across his entire childhood, told reporters after his mother's death that it would be easier to count the times they had not been chased than to count the times they had. The violence on those roads had been part of the landscape of this work for years before it killed anyone. The couple had agreements between themselves about what to do when it got close. If they came to a roadblock, they had decided they would not stop. They would not allow themselves to be taken. Whatever the cost of running, they would pay it. Sam Davis said this out loud after Nancy died, and said it without drama, as a simple statement of the terms under which they had been operating for a long time. By the beginning of 2011, the particular stretch of Tamaulipas, where the Davis couple had been working for decades, had become one of the most dangerous places in North America. The Gulf Cartel and the Zetas, which had originally been the Gulf Cartel's paramilitary enforcement wing before breaking away into an independent organization, were in the middle of a war for control of the drug smuggling routes that ran through northeastern Tamaulipas and across the border into Texas. The fighting between the two organizations had turned the state into a killing field. The town of San Fernando, on the highway that connected the interior of the state to the border city of Reynosa, had become a name that people in both Mexico and the United States associated with mass atrocity. In August of 2010, 5 months before Nancy Davis was killed on that same stretch of road, the bodies of 72 migrants, most of them from Central America, had been discovered at a ranch in San Fernando. They had been abducted and murdered by Zetas members. The massacre was the largest single killing of migrants ever documented in Mexico's drug war. A prosecutor and a transit police officer who had been involved in investigating that case had since turned up dead, a reminder of how reliable the cartel's intimidation of investigators in that region had become. Sam Davis had tried to reach the village churches earlier in January, before the day he and Nancy drove in together. He had crossed the border and encountered conditions bad enough that he turned back. His mother, Francile, later described what he told her. He had seen dead bodies scattered across the roads in the area. The drug war had made reaching the churches he had spent decades building a practical impossibility for stretches of that month. Nancy had stopped making some of the trips herself, because of how dangerous the roads had become. Francine Davis said later, with the particular weight of a mother describing something she could not change, that for some reason, Nancy had gone in on that Wednesday and had not come out alive. The reason they went in on January 26th was practical and specific. They were driving that day to pay the pastors at the village churches the family had established over nearly 4 decades. This was ordinary ministry maintenance, the kind of work that does not wait for conditions to improve, because conditions in Tamaulipas in early 2011 were not likely to improve soon, and the pastors and their congregations still needed to be supported. Sam and Nancy loaded up their 2008 Chevrolet pickup, a heavy-duty, high-profile truck of exactly the kind that Tamaulipas area cartels had been systematically stealing off the roads for months. The FAR Texas police chief, Ruben Velasquez, would note after the attack that the area where the couple was shot had seen 40 violent vehicle thefts in the 2 months leading up to that day, and that the Davises' truck was precisely the kind of vehicle that armed groups in the region were seizing by force. The damage to the truck's quarter paneling that investigators would later examine suggested that another vehicle had attempted to physically ram them at some point during the incident. The road they were on was the 2-lane highway that connects San Fernando to the border city of Reynosa, running roughly 70 miles north through open country in one of the most contested smuggling corridors in northeastern Mexico. Somewhere on that road, the Davises encountered a cartel roadblock. Men with automatic rifles and masks had set up a stopping point across the road, the kind of unauthorized checkpoint that armed groups in Tamaulipas had been establishing with growing frequency as the turf war between the Gulf Cartel and the Zetas made controlling road access a tactical necessity. Drivers who complied with these checkpoints risked robbery, kidnapping, or worse, depending on who had set them up and what they needed that day. Drivers who did not comply risked being shot. Sam Davis did not stop. He had made this decision in advance, with Nancy, as a matter of settled principle. They had talked about it. They had agreed. He hit the accelerator and drove through the roadblock. The men who had set it up responded with gunfire. Gunmen in a pickup truck gave chase and kept shooting. Sam could hear the semi-automatic weapons firing behind him and around him. He stiffened, he said later, and grabbed the steering wheel and prepared for the bullets to come through the sides of the vehicle. Then the rear window of the truck shattered. The bullet hit Nancy in the back of the head. She slumped forward and went unconscious immediately. Blood began covering the console and the seat beside him. Sam laid his hand on her neck. He could feel her heartbeat still going. He had just come through a cartel roadblock under fire. His wife was bleeding and unconscious in the passenger seat, and he had more than 70 miles of Tamaulipas road between him and the Texas border. He drove at 137 miles per hour. He said later that even at that speed, the distance seemed to take forever. He was alone in a bullet-riddled truck on a 2-lane Mexican highway with a dying woman beside him and no one to call who could arrive faster than he could drive. He kept his hand on the steering wheel and kept driving north through the flat, hot country of Tamaulipas, not stopping, not slowing down, watching the fuel gauge and the road and the mirror, his wife motionless beside him. When he reached the FAR International Bridge, the crossing that connects Reynosa, Mexico, to the border town of FAR, Texas, he drove against traffic. There was a line of vehicles waiting to cross in the proper lane, and he had no time for it. He drove the wrong way across the bridge, forcing his way to the checkpoint, and when he got to the American side, he told the border officials what had happened. The FAR Police Department issued a statement documenting the time of crossing at approximately 12:25 in the afternoon. Nancy Davis was rushed to a hospital in McAllen, Texas. She was pronounced dead about 90 minutes after her husband drove her across the bridge. At her funeral in McAllen, missionaries who had known the couple gathered from communities across the country. Sam Davis spoke publicly in the days and weeks that followed with a combination of grief and composure that people who covered the story found difficult to fully characterize. He said he missed Nancy terribly. He said the experience had been the most horrible of his life. He also said that he prayed for the men who had shot her. He prayed for them, he explained, because they needed to be saved. He doubted that they would ever be brought to justice by any earthly authority. He had seen enough of how Tamaulipas worked to understand that the investigation into Nancy's death would face the same obstacles that had stalled every other investigation in that region. A Tamaulipas state spokesman confirmed that the state was investigating the assault and the discharging of the firearm, but was not investigating a murder, because Nancy Davis had died on American soil. No arrests in her killing have ever been publicly announced. 2 weeks after the shooting, Sam Davis said he intended to go back. He wanted to continue the work that he and Nancy had built together across 38 years. The churches and medical clinics in the villages, the pastors who were still there and still needed to be paid. He acknowledged that going back might kill him. He said he was going anyway. The truck he drove out of Tamaulipas that afternoon was blue, with a shattered rear window and blood on the seat and console, and a quarter panel damaged from where another vehicle had tried to force it off the road. FAR Police Chief Ruben Vilescas had said in the days after the shooting that the vehicle the Davises drove was prized by cartels operating in the area. The most straightforward interpretation of what happened on that highway is that an armed group set up a roadblock to stop and take a truck they wanted, that Sam Davis refused to stop because he and his wife had decided years ago that refusing was the only reasonable response to that situation, and that Nancy Davis was shot in the back of the head at range as the vehicle accelerated away. There was no political dimension to it. There was no targeting of missionaries or Americans in particular. There was a valuable truck, a roadblock, and a driver who did not stop. What it cost was a 59-year-old woman who had spent nearly 4 decades driving into one of the most dangerous corners of Mexico to pay pastors at the churches she and her husband had spent a lifetime building. Sam drove her home at 137 miles per hour through the country she had come to love, and it still wasn't fast enough. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Nancy Davis died because a cartel wanted a truck and her husband would not surrender it. The next case moves 3 years forward and 1,000 miles south to the Pacific coast of Mexico, where a New York stock trader turned travel blogger set out on a motorcycle toward Brazil and disappeared into the mountains of Guerrero because a drug gang decided that a foreign man riding alone through their territory could only mean one thing. Section 7. Harry Devitt. Harry Devitt had been collecting dangerous situations for years before Mexico killed him. He had been chased at gunpoint in Colombia. In Venezuela, 2 men had shoved a gun barrel into his mouth hard enough to chip his tooth. He had watched a crowd hack a man apart with machetes in a Rio de Janeiro favela. He had written about all of it, publicly, in the voice of someone who had decided at some point in his mid-20s that the world would not reveal itself to people who stayed in comfortable places, and that the gap between fear and experience was something worth crossing repeatedly. He called himself a gypsy at heart. He wrote, in a blog post that circulated widely after he disappeared, that he had been in some of the poorest and most dangerous parts of the world, and some of the finest, and that he still could not tell which he had liked more. He wrote that life was a pilgrimage. He was from Pelham, a suburb in Westchester County, just north of New York City. His formal education had stopped at an associate's degree from Westchester Community College, and his mother, Anne, remembered him as someone who believed that experience was the best teacher and had arranged his entire adult life around that conviction. He had taught himself to trade stocks while managing a chat room for a hedge fund in Palm Beach, Florida, and had built up enough money doing it to fund several years of continuous travel. He set out at 27 on what was supposed to be a 5-year trip around the world, and he kept going. Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil, Spain, France, India, Nepal. He wrote about all of it on a blog called A New Yorker Travels, which accumulated a following of more than 11,000 people on Instagram who looked forward to seeing what corner of the world he would turn up in next. He was the kind of person whose adventures made other people feel that something larger than ordinary life was still available, if they were willing to look for it. In October of 2013, he documented something that would seem remarkable in retrospect. He wrote on his blog that he had never ridden a motorcycle. He was completely inexperienced with them. He noted this plainly, without embarrassment, as a minor logistical detail, rather than a reason to reconsider the plan he was about to describe. He said he was going to go to the DMV the next day, get his motorcycle permit, buy a bike, and try to figure out how to ride it home without crashing, which he acknowledged would probably be an adventure in itself. Then, he wrote, in the next 2 or 3 weeks, he was going to ride that motorcycle across America, through Central America, down to Brazil for the 2014 World Cup, and eventually all the way south to Ushuaia at the tip of Argentina, the southernmost city in the world. The post had a quality that was entirely characteristic of everything else he had ever written: the cheerful, matter-of-fact confidence of a man who had learned from enough close calls that the distance between planning and doing was shorter than most people assumed. By January of 2014, he was 44 days into the trip. He had been posting photographs along the way, and his Instagram feed in the weeks before he disappeared showed him at volcanoes, waterfalls, ancient ruins, a cavern, a mountain sunrise. He was in Mexico, working his way toward the Pacific coast and the port city of Zihuatanejo, in the state of Guerrero. He had a specific reason for wanting to reach Zihuatanejo that had nothing to do with cartel geography or drug war logistics. The final scene of The Shawshank Redemption, the scene where Andy Dufresne walks into the surf on a beautiful Pacific beach, had been filmed there, and DeVert wanted to photograph that beach himself. Getting to it meant crossing through territory that in January of 2014 was as operationally complex as any piece of Mexican landscape in the country. The border between the states of Michoacán and Guerrero ran through what was called the Tierra Caliente, the hot land, a region that had been under the effective control of a criminal organization called the Knights Templar, successors to a cartel called La Familia Michoacana. For years, the Knights Templar had built a particularly invasive criminal empire, extracting payments from farmers, small businesses, miners, and anyone else operating in their territory. But by early 2014, the cartel was being fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. Armed citizen militia groups called Autodefensas, which had first appeared in Michoacán in 2013, had mushroomed into a formidable popular movement with thousands of combatants advancing town by town through Knights Templar territory. The Mexican federal government had sent thousands of soldiers and police into the region. The state border between Michoacán and Guerrero, exactly the area DeVert needed to cross to reach Zihuatanejo, was being contested by all of these forces at once, and the men doing the contesting wore camouflage and carried automatic weapons and made decisions about who belonged in their territory based on criteria that had nothing to do with tourist itineraries. On the morning of January 25, 2014, DeVert checked out of a bed and breakfast in a small town in Michoacán, near the region famous for its monarch butterfly sanctuary. He sent his girlfriend, Sarah Ashley Shear, a text message via WhatsApp. He told her that he had just spent an hour and a half being escorted by military personnel out of an area that was too dangerous for him to be in. He said he was getting back on the road soon. He mentioned that apparently another military escort was waiting for him in a different town up ahead. He wrote that he was running very late because of all the military activity. It was the last message anyone who loved him received. After that, nothing. The text had a specific character worth sitting with. He was describing being escorted, not stopped or detained. He was describing military presence not as a threat, but as an inconvenience that was delaying his schedule. He had been through enough in enough countries to read a dangerous situation and respond accordingly, and his tone in that final message was not frightened. It was the tone of someone mildly annoyed at a delay, not someone who understood that the road ahead of him was about to end. What he was navigating on that stretch between Michoacán and Guerrero was, in early 2014, one of the most dangerous corridors in Mexico. Armed groups in military-style uniforms were everywhere, and the distinction between actual government forces, autodefensas militias, and cartel members who had infiltrated or copied the autodefensas' look was not always possible to establish at a glance. Men in camouflage with automatic weapons who controlled access to roads might represent any of several different competing organizations with very different interests in who passed through and why. A lone foreigner on a motorcycle, with no apparent affiliation and no clear explanation for his presence in the region, was, to certain people in that landscape, an obvious subject of suspicion. His mother Anne traveled to Mexico after it became clear her son had vanished. She spent time in the state of Michoacán, meeting local authorities and residents, trying to piece together what had happened. There were unconfirmed tips, passed along through informal channels, that Divert was being held at a ranch somewhere in the region, alive. For a period, these tips generated a specific kind of desperate hope that anyone who has spent time waiting for news of a missing person recognizes. The hope that attaches to uncertainty, because uncertainty still contains the possibility of survival. The tips were wrong. Mexican authorities, acting on separate intelligence in early July of 2014, located something on a road leading toward La Mahahua Beach in the state of Guerrero. Alongside a road near that beach, buried in a shallow grave, they found a green Kawasaki motorcycle and, in 2 plastic bags that had been partially buried in the same location, human remains that were badly decomposed. 10 packages of what appeared to be narcotics, a mixture of marijuana and cocaine, were found near the motorcycle and the bags. The discovery was made roughly 16 miles from the tourist town of Zihuatanejo, the city Divert had been riding toward when he disappeared. The remains had apparently been moved at some point from an original burial location to this shallow grave near the beach. On July 18, 2014, DNA testing confirmed that the remains were Harry Divert. He had been killed roughly 6 months earlier, dismembered, placed in bags, and buried. He was 32 years old. The explanation for why he was killed came from a federal official speaking to journalists on the condition of anonymity, which reflected the sensitivity of the finding. The gang responsible for his death had apparently concluded that the foreign man on a motorcycle passing alone through their territory was not a traveler headed for a World Cup beach. They had concluded he was an undercover agent of the United States government. That determination, reached by men for whom a lone foreigner moving quietly through remote cartel-controlled territory fit a pattern they had learned to identify, was the thing that cost Harry Divert his life. He had been in some of the poorest and most dangerous parts of the world for 5 years, and had navigated all of it. He had come home from gunpoint in Colombia, and from a gun barrel shoved against his teeth in Venezuela. He had photographed volcanoes and waterfalls in Mexico in the weeks before he died, and posted them for his 11,000 followers. None of it had prepared him for the specific problem of what a drug gang in the Guerrero Mountains would decide about his purpose when they saw him. The man identified as leading the organization responsible was named Adrian Reyes Cadena, 25 years old, known by the nickname El Tigre. He reportedly led a gang called the Guerrero Guard, which had grown out of the same criminal ecosystem as the Knights Templar. He was arrested in August of 2015 in Zihuatanejo, the beach city that Divert had been trying to reach. Mexican federal police charged him with kidnapping and murder charges connected to Divert's death, along with separate charges connected to the kidnapping of an Italian businessman in 2014 and the disappearance of 2 federal Mexican officials in 2013. A second person, Mariano Sierra Santana, described as a founding member of a drug gang called the Viagras, composed of former autodefensa militia members, was also arrested in connection with the case. Anne Devitt had questions that the arrest did not fully answer. She told reporters that she still had a lot of unanswered questions about what had happened to her son, and that everything felt like a vast web of intrigue. She was right to be skeptical. The official explanation that the gang had mistaken a New York stock trader turned travel blogger for a government agent was both entirely plausible given the paranoia endemic to organizations operating in that part of Mexico in early 2014, and profoundly inadequate as a reason for what had been done. Plausible does not mean acceptable. It means understandable in the specific narrow sense of fitting a pattern. Devitt's blog post from October of 2013, the one where he announced he was learning to ride a motorcycle, had a line near the end that described what he hoped the journey would be. He said he had never been bored in his life and that he intended to keep it that way. He had spent 5 years turning that intention into something real, crossing the world on the strength of his own nerve and curiosity, and Mexico in January of 2014 was where it ran out. Not because he made a reckless choice, but because he was an unfamiliar man moving alone through territory where unfamiliar men moving alone were assumed to be enemies until proven otherwise, and nobody gave him the chance to prove otherwise. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Harry Devitt was killed because a drug gang decided a lone traveler on a motorcycle had to be a government spy. 4 years later, almost exactly the same logic played out in a set of mountain canyons in Chihuahua, where a Spanish teacher from North Carolina stepped out of his hotel for a hike and walked into the same fatal assumption. Section 8. Patrick Braxton Andrew. Patrick Braxton Andrew spent his vacations going places that required planning, not resorts or tourist circuits, but the out-of-the-way corners of Latin America that most people his age passed over in favor of something easier. He was 34 years old, from Davidson, North Carolina, and he taught Spanish at the Woodlawn School in Mooresville, which meant he carried the language he loved into a classroom every day and carried his passport into remote mountain valleys every chance he got. His father, Gary, described him to reporters as someone who actively sought out hidden places, the overlooked and difficult-to-reach corners of countries that rewarded the effort of getting there. His childhood friend Russell Miller described him as an avid runner who had traveled extensively through Latin America, building the kind of geographic knowledge that comes only from actually showing up. He was the kind of person who reads a book about an ultramarathon in a mountain canyon in northern Mexico and immediately begins working out how to get there himself. The book was Born to Run by Christopher McDougall, published in 2009, and focused heavily on the Rarámuri, an indigenous people of the Sierra Madre Occidental in Chihuahua, Mexico, who had developed a tradition of long-distance running through one of the most spectacular pieces of terrain on the continent. The terrain was the Copper Canyon, a network of deep, river-carved chasms in the mountains of Chihuahua that collectively form a canyon system larger and in some places deeper than the Grand Canyon. The town of Urique, sitting at the bottom of one of those canyons, had been the start and finish line for the ultramarathon race that McDougall wrote about. For a runner and traveler who had read the book, Urique was the kind of destination that sits in the back of the mind until circumstances make it accessible. By October of 2018, Braxton Andrew had decided the circumstances were right. He booked travel from North Carolina to Chihuahua and planned a route that would take him into the canyon by train and then down by bus into Urique, followed by hiking in the canyon wilderness, followed by travel south to meet his brother in Mexico City at the end of the month. It was a well-considered trip by a well-traveled person who understood Latin American logistics and terrain, and who had spent years building exactly the kind of experience base that makes solo travel in remote areas manageable. What he had not built experience with, and what no amount of Latin American travel would have prepared him for, was the specific human geography of the Sierra Tarahumara in 2018. The Copper Canyon region is one of the genuinely beautiful places on Earth, and it is also Beneath that beauty, a drug trafficking corridor that the Sinaloa cartel had been using for decades to move marijuana, heroin, and increasingly fentanyl through the mountains and toward the United States border. The particular stretch of the Sierra Madre that includes Urique, Cerro Cahui, Bahuichivo, and the surrounding villages was controlled at that time by a cell of the Sinaloa organization called Los Salazar, whose local armed wing, Gente Nueva, had established effective dominion over the terrain. Illegal logging, which provided cover for money laundering, was also a significant cartel activity in the area. The canyons that drew hikers and tourists from across the world were the same terrain through which armed men moved drugs and enforced cartel authority over communities that had largely stopped expecting protection from any government. The local commander of this operation was a man named Jose Noriel Portillo Gil, born in Urique itself in 1992. He was 26 years old when Braxton Andrew arrived in his territory, and he had built, by official Chihuahua state estimates, an army of roughly 1,000 armed men drawn from communities across the Sierra Madre. His nickname was El Chueco, which translates roughly as the Crooked One, a reference to a life that had never run straight. Local residents in Urique and surrounding villages described him with the particular silence of people who understand that speaking freely about someone carries immediate consequences. His name was not said in public. People believed there was always someone listening, and they were probably right. He drove through the mountain communities in modern vehicles, some of them armored, collecting payments from farmers and businesses, overseeing drug production and transport, and operating with the confidence of a man who understood that the official government presence in the Sierra Tarahumara was thin, unreliable, and in significant part already on his payroll. The mayor of Urique, a man named Daniel Silva, along with the town's entire police force, would later be placed under formal investigation by the Chihuahua State Attorney General's office on allegations that they had not merely tolerated El Chueco's presence, but had actively facilitated it, providing him protection and even the use of official police vehicles. The mayor's whereabouts became unknown once the investigation was announced. He had simply left his office and not returned. This was the institutional environment in the town where Patrick Braxton Andrew arrived on October 26, 2018, a guest at a small hotel in a canyon village where the police and the cartel were, by every available indication, the same people. He left North Carolina on October 24th, landed in Chihuahua City, and the next morning boarded the Copper Canyon Railway, the famous El Chepe train that traverses the rim of the canyon system and is itself one of the most celebrated rail journeys in North America. He spent the night near the top of the canyon. On October 26th, he posted photographs to social media showing his descent by bus into the canyon, the kind of images that tell people back home that a trip is going well. He settled into his hotel in Urique and spent time at the town's only internet cafe, which had the sporadic connectivity typical of that region, sending text messages to friends in the United States. Those messages were his last communications. On the morning of October 28th, he went out on a hike. He had come to Urique specifically for the trails of Copper Canyon National Park, and he used the morning hours to walk them. By 4 in the afternoon, hotel staff saw him leave the building. He did not return. 2 days later, when he failed to arrive in Mexico City to meet his brother as planned, the family understood something had gone wrong and began trying to trace his movements backward through the canyon. What happened to him on October 28th was confirmed by the Chihuahua State Governor, Javier Corral Jurado, who announced on his Facebook page on November 15th that Braxton Andrew had been killed by Jose Noriel Portillo Gil. The governor's announcement was blunt in its identification of the killer. The stated motive was equally direct. El Chueco had encountered Braxton Andrew and heard him speaking English. From that single observation, he had concluded that the foreign man walking through his territory was an undercover agent of the Drug Enforcement Administration. Multiple local news sources and subsequent reporting confirmed this version of events. The trigger was language. He spoke English in the Sierra Tarahumara, and that was sufficient for a cartel commander whose understanding of why a foreigner would travel alone through that terrain was filtered entirely through the lens of his own criminal operation and the surveillance he feared from American agencies. Braxton Andrew was shot in the head with a 9mm weapon. The autopsy confirmed this. His body was moved after the killing, which investigators could determine from a specific physical detail. His body carried traces of reddish dirt and pine leaves consistent with the mountain terrain, but he was found lying on a stony surface without vegetation, indicating he had been transported from a different location and placed at a spot that had already been searched during the early phase of the investigation. This was not carelessness. It was the deliberate placement of a body in a location already cleared from the search grid, a calculation about where it would be found latest. The family had gone to Mexico within days of realizing Patrick was missing. They set up a Facebook page to coordinate the search effort, and more than 100 police officers fanned out through the canyon region, moving along rocky paths and through steep gorges. The Chihuahua State Prosecutor's Office released photographs of the search operation. The family's posts during this period combined the specific urgency of people who have not yet received the worst news with the growing awareness that the region they were searching was one where information did not move freely and where institutional cooperation had its limits. His body was found on November 17th. The family posted that same day that it had been recovered and would be brought home. 3 weeks had passed between his death and the recovery of his remains. For all of that time, he had been lying in terrain he had come to explore. What happened next with El Chueco followed the pattern of impunity that characterizes criminal leadership in remote Mexican territory. He was named publicly as the killer by the state governor. A warrant for his arrest was issued. He remained free. He continued operating in Urique, Cerocahui, and the surrounding villages with no visible reduction in his activities. When Chihuahua State Police or federal forces did venture into the area, they moved through communities where every resident understood that cooperation with the investigation carried consequences, and where the line between official law enforcement and cartel protection was blurry enough to make cooperation genuinely dangerous. El Chueco was not done killing. In June of 2022, nearly 4 years after Patrick Braxton Andrews' death, he entered the village of Cerocahui in Urique municipality in a rage following a lost baseball game he had been wagering on. He sought out a man connected to the opposing team and shot him. 2 Jesuit priests, Javier Campos and Joaquin Mora, who tried to intervene and plead for the man's life, were also shot and killed. The murders of 2 Catholic priests in a mission town in the Sierra Tarahumara produced international outrage and a major military response in the region. Hundreds of Army and National Guard members were deployed into the mountains to find him. They did not. He was killed in March of 2023 in a military operation in the municipality of Xua, in neighboring Sinaloa state, where he had apparently taken refuge. Mexican army forces reported being attacked by an armed group there, returned fire, and killed Jose Noriel Portillo Gil. DNA testing confirmed the identity. He died in a firefight rather than in a courtroom. He was 30 years old. The Chihuahua State Attorney General's office subsequently linked El Chueco to at least 12 additional homicides in the Sierra Tarahumara beyond the cases that had already been publicly named. Patrick Braxton Andrew was among the first Americans he killed. The 2 teachers from Chihuahua who he had shot to steal their car were also in the ledger. The 2 Jesuit priests were the last. He had operated with effective impunity for 5 years between the arrest warrant issued for Braxton Andrews' murder and his own death, during which time he killed multiple people, ran a drug trafficking cell in one of Mexico's most remote and beautiful landscapes, and remained beyond the reach of any legal process. For Patrick Braxton Andrew, the Copper Canyon had been a destination he had carried in his mind since reading about it, a place of genuine wonder at the intersection of indigenous culture, extreme terrain, and the longest-running tradition he had ever learned about. He taught Spanish in North Carolina, traveled Latin America in his spare time, and saved enough vacation days to make the trip to Urique in the fall of 2018. He was on the last hike of a trip that had been going well. His photographs from the days before he died showed him descending into a canyon of extraordinary beauty. He was 34 years old, and the only thing that ended that trip was a cartel commander who heard English coming from his direction and drew a conclusion that had nothing to do with the truth and everything to do with the specific paranoia of a man who ran drugs through a mountain range and feared being caught. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Patrick Braxton Andrew was killed by one man acting on a single wrong assumption about who he was. The next case involves a different scale of violence entirely, a cartel attack in Sonora in November 2019 that killed 9 members of the same family, 3 mothers and 6 children, in an ambush on an open highway that lasted long enough for the survivors to escape on foot into the desert. Section 9. The LeBaron Family Massacre, 2019. La Mora is a small settlement about 70 miles south of Douglas, Arizona, in the high desert country of Sonora, Mexico. 300 people live there, most of them descendants of families that came to the region generations ago as part of a fundamentalist Mormon movement that had split from the mainstream church over the question of polygamy. The community is not affiliated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It has its own identity, its own traditions, and its own history of building a life in a landscape that rewards patience and self-sufficiency. The families of La Mora had farmed the land, raised cattle, built homes, and kept their dual American and Mexican citizenship alive across generations. They were conspicuous in the Sierra Madre region for their fair hair and light skin, and for the size and modernity of their homes relative to their Mexican neighbors, and they had built something that, despite everything that had happened around it over the years, still resembled the kind of quiet, rooted community that a founder might have envisioned when he first chose the land. 10 years before the morning of November 4th, 2019, the violence that surrounded La Mora had reached one of its ugliest moments. A man named Benjamin LeBaron, who had organized his community into a public anti-cartel movement and led protests to the state governor after his teenage brother was kidnapped, had been dragged from his home by armed men and shot to death outside town. The message left at the scene was direct about what his killers wanted the community to understand. The community had understood. It had mourned, and it had kept going, because people who have built generational roots in a place do not easily leave it, even when the risks pile up. By 2019, the extended LeBaron and Langford families had been living alongside cartel violence in Chihuahua and Sonora for decades. They had adapted to it the way people adapt to a chronic and unpredictable danger, with awareness, with caution, with roots they had learned and roots they had learned to avoid, and with the daily decision to stay. On the morning of November 4th, 3 women packed their children into 3 SUVs and set out from La Mora. They were heading in different directions. Ronita Maria Miller, 30 years old, was driving toward Phoenix, Arizona, to pick up her husband from the airport. She had 4 of her children with her, in a yellow Chevrolet Tahoe: 12-year-old Howard Jacob Miller Jr., 10-year-old Crystal Belaine Miller, and 8-month-old twins named Titus and Tiana. Her other 3 children had stayed home. Christina Marie Langford Johnson, 29, and Donna Ray Langford, 43, were traveling together with their children toward Chihuahua City for a family wedding. Christina had her 7-month-old daughter Faith with her. Donna had 9 children in her vehicle, including 11-year-old Trevor and 2-year-old Rogan. The 3 women and 14 children left La Mora together that morning on dirt roads through the Sierra Madre that community members had been using for errands and family visits for years. Somewhere along the route, Ronita's Tahoe got a flat tire. She fell behind the other 2 vehicles while she dealt with it, which put roughly 10 miles of remote mountain road between her convoy position and Christina and Donna's vehicles by the time they reached the area where the cartel was waiting. Ronita's Tahoe was hit first. The vehicle was found about 2 kilometers from the village of San Miguelito in Sonora, completely burned. 5 charred bodies were inside, all of them shot as well as burned. One family member who later described the scene said that only ashes and a few bones remained of Ronita and her children. The fact that the vehicle was set on fire suggests either that the attackers wanted to destroy evidence or that the Tahoe was set ablaze in the course of the attack itself, possibly hit in a way that ignited the fuel. Whatever the sequence, by the time the fire was out, Ronita Miller and 4 of her children were gone. 10 miles further along the road, the gunman found the other 2 vehicles. Christina Langford Johnson did something in those final moments that people who knew her have described as characteristic of who she was. She understood, in the seconds after gunmen approached, that the only chance anyone had was to make the attackers understand they had made a mistake. She placed her baby daughter's car seat on the floor of the vehicle for protection, then got out of the SUV and stood in the open road with her hands raised, waving them, trying to signal with her body that there were only women and children here, that this was a misunderstanding, that they should stop. The attackers did not stop. Children who survived and later described what happened said Christina was shot twice, in the heart, while standing in the road with her arms in the air. Her body was found about 15 yards from the SUV. Inside the vehicle, surrounding by bullet holes, her daughter Faith was found alive, unharmed in her car seat on the floor where her mother had placed her before getting out. Donna Ray Langford and her children came under fire in the second white Suburban. Donna's 13-year-old son Devon was in the vehicle. He later told ABC News that his mother began to pray as the shooters approached, trying to reach the steering wheel to drive out of the attack. She was shot and killed in front of him. His brothers Trevor, 11, and Rogan, 2, were also shot and killed. Devin, who was uninjured, understood immediately that he was responsible for the children around him, 5 of whom were bleeding from gunshot wounds. He got them out of the vehicle and into the scrub brush that covered the mountain terrain. He covered them with branches to hide them and reduce the chance that any gunmen who returned to the area would see them. Then he started walking. He walked 14 miles through the Sierra Madre Mountains, on rough terrain, in the hours after watching his mother and 2 brothers killed in front of him, to reach La Mora and bring help. He arrived at approximately 5:30 in the afternoon, 6 hours after the attack began. He had walked the entire way alone, thinking, he said later, about whether there might be other armed men somewhere on the trail behind him, and about his mother, and about his brothers. He was 13 years old. When Devon did not return to his siblings as expected, his 9-year-old sister Mackenzie decided she could not keep waiting. She had been grazed by a bullet during the attack. She left the hiding place with the remaining children and walked in a different direction, trying to reach help on her own. She was eventually found that same night. The 5 children who had remained hidden in the bushes for hours, some of them treating each other's wounds as best they could, and all of them managing the terror of not knowing if the men who had killed their mothers were coming back, were eventually reached by family members who had driven out from La Mora after Devon arrived. A Mexican military helicopter transported 5 of the surviving children to hospitals in the United States. Baby Faith, 7 months old, was found in her car seat on the floor of the bullet-riddled Suburban that had been her mother's vehicle. She was unhurt. She was later reunited with her father, Tyler Johnson, who had been in the United States when the attack happened. Her mother had put her on the floor and gotten out of the car to try to save her. The last act Christina Langford Johnson performed was moving her daughter out of the line of fire, and the act worked, even though nothing else did. The cartel group responsible for the attack was identified by Mexican military authorities as La Línea, the enforcement arm of the Juarez cartel, which had been engaged in a territorial war with Sinaloa cartel factions for control of the region straddling the Sonora-Chihuahua border. Mexican officials offered a theory that has been repeated in subsequent reporting. The SUV convoy may have been mistaken for rival cartel vehicles. The model of Chevrolet Suburban was commonly used by criminal organizations operating in those mountains, and gunmen positioned along the route, watching for rivals, may have seen three large American-style SUVs moving through contested territory and drawn a conclusion that had nothing to do with the truth of who was inside them. An alternative theory that circulated in family discussions and some press accounts suggested the attack was not accidental at all, that the women were targeted deliberately as a message to a community that had long resisted cartel demands. The investigation that followed never definitively established which version was correct. Both are consistent with what is known about how cartels operate in contested Sierra Madre territory, where the price of using the wrong road on the wrong day has no relationship to who you actually are. Alex LeBaron, a member of the extended family and a state legislator in Chihuahua, went on radio the day after the attack and said it could not possibly have been a mistake, that what had happened was terrorism without qualification. His brother Julian, who had spent a decade channeling the grief from Benjamin's murder into peace activism and political organizing, released statements calling for justice and accountability. The family had buried Benjamin LeBaron 10 years earlier after he was killed for standing up publicly against the cartel that dominated their region. Now they were burying Ronita and Christina and Donna and 6 children in the same mountains. The arrests that followed moved slowly. Initial detentions were made in the weeks after the attack, but one early suspect was released after being cleared of involvement. Roberto Gonzalez Montes, known by the nicknames El 32 and El Mudo, meaning the mute one, was arrested later as an alleged cartel leader connected to the massacre. Gustavo Hernandez Cabral was arrested in New Mexico in September of 2023 and held pending extradition to Mexico in connection with the attack. On the civil side, a federal judge in North Dakota issued a judgment holding the Juarez cartel liable for more than $1 billion in damages to the surviving families, a ruling that reflected the American legal system's capacity to reach a conclusion even when the criminal justice system's process remained incomplete. Julian LeBaron, speaking in the aftermath, described the massacre with a directness that came from having already spent a decade living with what cartel violence had done to his family. He had grown up in La Mora, had watched his brother Benjamin become a nationally known figure and then be killed for it, had spent years trying to build a peace movement in a region that seemed to respond to peace movements with violence, and had now watched 3 women and 6 children killed on a road that community members had been using for ordinary errands for as long as anyone in La Mora could remember. His cousin Ronita had been on her way to pick up her husband from an airport in Phoenix, the most ordinary of family logistics, when her Tahoe was burned on a mountainside in Sonora with her and 4 of her children inside. The detail that does not leave the story of November 4, 2019, is the one about Christina Langford Johnson standing in the road with her arms up. She had placed her baby on the floor first. She knew what she was doing when she got out of the car. She understood that armed men who believe they are in a firefight with rivals do not necessarily look closely at what they are actually shooting at, and she decided to make them look, to make the correction impossible to miss, to put herself between the bullets and the people in the vehicles behind her. The attackers looked and shot her anyway. Her daughter survived. Her brother Stephen Langford said afterward that it was impossible to understand how someone could do what was done on that road with a clear conscience, that it was a massacre, completely and without qualification, and that he did not know how it squared with the conscience of the men responsible. It probably did not weigh on them at all. That is the honest answer. The road through the Sierra Madre was contested territory, and the vehicles looked like the right ones to hit, and what was inside them was not a consideration until it was too late for that consideration to matter. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 3 mothers and 6 children were killed because cartel gunmen on a mountain road made a decision about who was inside 3 SUVs and never paused long enough to find out they were wrong. The final case moves from the mountains of Sonora to the streets of a Texas border city, where four friends from South Carolina crossed the international bridge to get medical treatment and drove into the middle of a Gulf Cartel turf war that had nothing to do with them and everything to do with where they had parked their car. Section 10. The Matamoros Four. Zindel Brown had doubts about making this trip. His sister Zelandria said later that he had kept saying they probably should not go, that Mexico, in the current moment, was not a safe destination, that the risks on the other side of the border from Brownsville were real and not abstract. He went anyway. That is the kind of thing that happens between people who are close, where loyalty to someone you love pulls harder than the caution you know makes sense, and where saying no eventually gives way to the understanding that you would rather be there with them than somewhere else without them. Zindel Brown was from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and he was going to Mexico in March of 2023 because a close friend needed support for a medical procedure, and he was the kind of person who showed up. The friend who needed support was Latavia Washington McGee, known to everyone as Tay. She was a mother of 5 from South Carolina who had arranged to have a cosmetic procedure, specifically an abdominoplasty, commonly called a tummy tuck, performed by a doctor who practiced in Matamoros, Mexico. Medical tourism of this kind had been growing for years along the Mexican border, particularly for procedures that cost significantly less in Mexico than in the American healthcare system. The city of Matamoros, sitting directly across the Rio Grande from Brownsville at the southernmost tip of Texas, had clinics that advertised to American patients, and the crossing was simple: a bridge over a river, a few minutes, and you were in Mexico. Thousands of Americans made that crossing for medical appointments without incident. Tay McGee had made an appointment and was going to keep it. Traveling with her were Zindel Brown, her cousin Shaid Woodard, and Eric James Williams, the driver of the group. They had driven from South Carolina to the Texas border together, the kind of long road trip that builds camaraderie and conversation and passes the time. A fifth person, a woman named Cheryl Orange, had made the trip from South Carolina with the group, but did not cross the international bridge. She did not have the documentation needed to enter Mexico, and stayed on the American side in Brownsville, while the other 4 crossed over on the morning of Friday, March 3rd, 2023, in a rented white minivan with North Carolina license plates. What none of them knew, and what no amount of research about Matamoros clinics would have surfaced from the kind of sources most people consult before a medical trip, was the specific operational state of the Matamoros drug trade in early March of 2023. The Gulf Cartel, which had controlled the city and the surrounding territory in Tamaulipas for years, was in the middle of an internal conflict. Factions of the cartel, including a violent enforcement unit called the Scorpions, had been fighting each other and rival organizations for control of the smuggling routes that ran through the city. That kind of internal cartel conflict produces a specific kind of danger for people who are not involved in it. Armed groups, actively looking for enemies, start looking at everything that moves through their territory as a potential threat. A rented white minivan with North Carolina plates, carrying 4 people who had just crossed from the American side of the border, fit the profile of something the Scorpions were watching for. Whether the gunman who targeted the 4 South Carolinians believed the minivan was carrying rival Sinaloa cartel operatives, or drug smugglers encroaching on their territory, or some other perceived threat, an internal Mexican government document reviewed by Reuters indicated that investigators believed the kidnapping occurred because cartel members thought the Americans had entered their turf without permission. Shortly after crossing into Matamoros, before they had reached the clinic, and before Tay McGee's appointment had even begun, the minivan came under fire. Gunmen opened up on the vehicle and its passengers, and 4 Americans who had driven across a river to get a medical procedure found themselves in the middle of a firefight they had not anticipated and had no capacity to escape. The attack did not end with the shooting. The gunmen then bundled the 4 Americans into a pickup truck and drove away from the scene. A Mexican woman named Arely Pablo Servando, 33 years old, who happened to be in the area, was struck by a stray bullet and killed. She had nothing to do with any of it. A viral video that circulated in the days after the attack showed armed men dragging at least one of the Americans, appearing to be seriously wounded, across the ground and into the truck. The images were difficult to watch. Cheryl Orange, still on the American side, realized when the group stopped responding to her that something had gone badly wrong. Brownsville police were contacted, checked hospitals and jails, found nothing, and alerted the FBI after confirming the four had crossed into Mexico. The 4-day span that followed sits largely in the space that separates the moment a news story breaks from the moment its outcome is confirmed. Investigators from multiple American agencies, including the FBI, ICE, ATF, the DEA, and the State Department, were working the case alongside Mexican authorities under the kind of bilateral pressure that a kidnapping of 4 American citizens generates immediately. The Mexican military deployed search operations around Matamoros. Eric Williams, shot in the leg, was reportedly taken to a clinic at some point during the captivity. McGee was alive, though the 4-day ordeal that she and Williams were surviving included watching what happened to Brown and Woodard. McGee's mother, Barbara Burgess, described what her daughter told her after it was over. She said that Tay had watched Zindell Brown, the friend who had come to support her and who had expressed doubts about the trip from the beginning, be executed in front of her. She watched Shaeed Woodard die as well. 2 people who had crossed a bridge with her on a Friday morning for what was supposed to be a manageable medical errand were killed in the days she spent in captivity, and she was present for both deaths. The 4-day ordeal, that her lawyers later called a nightmare, was something that no statement released through legal representatives would ever fully capture. On the morning of Tuesday, March 7th, Mexican authorities located a wooden shack in the rural Ejido Tecolote area east of Matamoros, on a road leading toward the Gulf Coast beach area known as Playa Baghdad. A man guarding the shack was arrested at the scene. Inside and just outside the structure, investigators found 4 Americans. McGee and Williams were alive. The body of one of the deceased was inside the shack. The second was found outside. The bodies of Shaeed Woodard and Zindell Brown were formally identified and repatriated to the United States on Thursday, March 9th, crossing back across the Veterans Port of Entry in Brownsville, the same border crossing that had brought them all into Mexico 6 days earlier. McGee and Williams were transported to a Texas hospital. Woodard and Brown were given prayer vigils in South Carolina. Friends of Zindell Brown gathered at Word of God Outreach Ministries in Scranton, South Carolina, where the community mourned a man who had gone to Mexico to look after someone he cared about and had not come home. Shaeed Woodard's family grieved a cousin who had gone along, because that was what this group of people did for each other. The 2 survivors were described by their attorneys as recovering from physical and psychological injuries that would not resolve quickly, while emphasizing that the support from people who had followed the case had meant something real to them. What the cartel did next was unusual enough that it drew significant attention. Within days of the attack, a handwritten letter, believed authentic by investigators who reviewed it, was delivered to Mexican authorities along with a photograph of 5 men lying face down on a pavement with their hands bound. The letter identified itself as coming from the Scorpions faction of the Gulf Cartel and said the organization had decided to turn over those directly responsible for the attack. The letter stated that those individuals had acted on their own judgment and without the discipline the cartel required of its members, that they had violated the organization's own rules about not targeting innocent people, and that the cartel was apologizing to the residents of Matamoros, to the family of the Mexican woman who had been killed, and to the American families affected. The cartel had murdered 2 American citizens and was issuing a written apology and handing over 5 bound men to local authorities, a response calibrated to manage the public relations and law enforcement fallout from an operation that had produced exactly the kind of international attention cartels try to avoid generating. Whether those 5 men were genuinely the individuals responsible, or whether they were lower-level members handed over to satisfy American pressure while more senior figures remained untouched, remained an open question in subsequent reporting. Mexican authorities later arrested 2 men described as senior leaders of the Gulf Cartel's Scorpions and Cyclones factions, the sons of Osiel Cardenas's nephew, alleging they had commanded the enforcement squads operating in Matamoros. A Texas man named Roberto Lugado Moreno was charged in an American court with straw purchasing a firearm that turned up during the investigation, specifically a rifle that Homeland Security investigations alleged was recovered in connection with the kidnapping. He allegedly admitted to buying the weapon and providing additional firearms to the cartel. The case reopened conversations in Congress that had been circulating for years without resolution. Specifically, the question of whether Mexican cartels should be formally designated as foreign terrorist organizations under American law, a classification that would significantly expand the legal tools available for prosecuting cartel members in the United States. Supporters of the designation pointed to Matamoros as proof that no American crossing into Mexico was safe. Opponents raised concerns about Mexican sovereignty and the diplomatic fallout such a designation would create. Neither outcome was resolved quickly. What did shift, at least temporarily, was the volume of Americans seeking medical procedures in Matamoros and other border cities, as the case generated coverage that reached potential patients who had not previously connected the idea of affordable cosmetic surgery in Mexico to the reality of armed cartel factions controlling the streets outside the clinic door. Tay McGee had gone to Matamoros for something ordinary. She had made an appointment with a doctor. She had asked people she trusted to make the trip with her so the drive would be shared and the experience would be less solitary. Zindel Brown had gone with misgivings he expressed clearly and then set aside because the people he was going with mattered more than his hesitation. Eric Williams drove. Shaid Woodard came along the way that cousins, who are also close friends, do, because the group was going and he was part of the group. There was no moment in any of this where they were doing something that the vast majority of people who made that same bridge crossing every day had any reason to fear. The border between Brownsville and Matamoros is one of the busiest crossing points in North America. The clinic they were heading to advertised to American patients. The procedure McGee had scheduled was routine. The white minivan with North Carolina plates had the same right to drive through Matamoros that every other vehicle crossing that bridge had. The Scorpions faction of the Gulf Cartel, watching their territory for threats on a Friday morning, saw something in that minivan that made them decide to open fire, and 2 people died in a wooden shack on the eastern edge of Matamoros, 4 days after the trip that was supposed to take an afternoon. Zindel Brown had kept saying they probably should not go. He went anyway, because that is what he did, and because saying no eventually gives way to loyalty, and because the person asking was someone whose company on the drive back to South Carolina he had every reason to expect he would be enjoying the following week. He was 34 years old. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.